I'm really excited to bring our next speaker up. We go back actually several years. Let's welcome Neeru up to the stage. Neeru's actually was at our very first Vegan Women's Summit. Hello, lady. How are you? Remember back in SF and that work?
Good old days. Yeah, that was great. That was the
I'm
best vegan women start to the vegan women summit.
Yeah, we for those that were not there in the early days, we started with 250 women in a WeWork, and we had all kinds of great people there. We had Pinky Cole, we had Kimberly Elise, quite a lot of rock stars showed up for that tiny WeWork, and it's only gone like this ever since. So I'm excited to have you today and to hear
Thanks for
about
having
your
me.
on the trends. So I'm going to hop off stage and I will let you take it away. Everybody, you are in good hands. As a reminder, drop your questions in the questions tab as Neeru is speaking today, so that she has lots of questions to get to at the end. And if you can put them in one sentence, we can pop them on the screen. So try not to write a big paragraph. It's easier for her to answer one sentence questions. All right, I will say goodbye.
Thanks, Jenny. Thanks for the intro. Hi, everybody. It's so great to be here with all of you today and to hear all the inspiring presentations so far. Just as a bit of quick context, as Jenny mentioned, my name is Neeru. I'm a principal at the Boston Consulting Group, and I've got over 9 years of experience in the consumer industry, doing a lot of consumer research, insights, and strategies. And I lead our alternative proteins topic in North America. So for those of you who might not be familiar with BCG, we're a global leading management consulting firm. We help our clients tackle their biggest challenges and capture their most interesting opportunities. And we've been working with companies across the value chain on the topic of alternative proteins and how they can really capitalize on this opportunity, both from a market perspective, but also from a climate perspective as well. So you might have seen out there, we published a lot of thought leadership papers on alternative proteins. Here's a selection of a couple of them. I'll just call out a few quick highlights. So the first one that we published in 2021 was about sizing the overall global alternative protein market. And we sized that to be $290 billion by 2035. And we said that with that, we'd capture about 11% of the total protein market. The second paper that we published in 2022 as a follow-on from that said that with that growth, we can save about a gigaton in carbon dioxide emissions, which is worth about $50 to $80 billion in avoided emissions. And then the third paper, which we published earlier this year, was to say if we want to capitalize on that market opportunity and that climate opportunity, we need to win with that mainstream consumer. And we laid out a 4-step approach to how to do that. And that's where I really want to focus on with all of you today in this workshop, is to walk you through all of the behavioral science research and the detailed consumer surveys that we've done across the world to really understand that mainstream consumer and how we can position all these alternative protein, meat, dairy products to really win with that consumer. And I'm hoping that those insights, as you're developing your companies, will help you think about the right questions. So to dive in and set the context, some of you might have seen some of this market data already, but I just wanted to ground us in the latest retail sales data in the US. And so what we see here is the alternative meat and dairy retail sales in billions of dollars from 2019 all the way through to the latest 2023 data. And the most recent data is that the market is trending towards more of a flat growth. And there's a bit of a divergent performance in terms of meat and dairy. Just to note, this doesn't include food service. And so this is just the retail market. And so what we've been seeing, obviously, is some ups and downs over the years, but most recently trending down, and the plant-based meat declining and dairy not growing as fast as it has been in recent years. And when we look at the data behind it, at least in the last year, the decrease has continued in terms of units, and the prices have increased, but not as steeply as they did last year. Well, why did we start with this context? Well, I wanted to just recall a few things about why this might have been impacted, and a couple of drivers that could be behind it is one, in terms of the channel shifts. So obviously we've seen that post-pandemic, there's been a bit of a shift from grocery retail into food service. So that could be a reason why those retail sales are going down. Secondly, obviously inflation, and we've seen a bit of tightening of wallets, which has limited our ability to really increase prices. And the third is there's been a lot of brands in the space who have entered, and so there's been a lot more options for consumers, but also potentially varying levels of quality, which has led to a few concerns on the consumer side. And then fourthly, what we've been seeing is that there's a communication gap between how companies are approaching the products versus how consumers are shopping and what their needs are. And we're calling this a marketing mismatch. And when you think about near-term actionability of all of these things, the easiest thing for individual companies to do is actually to think about that marketing mismatch, because all of the others will take a lot more forces to actually influence. So why does this matter for all of you? Well, I know that as you're thinking about developing your companies and thinking about what products you're building and what consumers you're serving, it's really helpful to put yourselves in the shoes of that consumer. And I'll walk you through what we've learned about how we can correct some of this marketing mismatch. So we conducted a survey of about 3,000 consumers globally to really understand what their motivations are when they're buying fresh food products and their attitudes towards sustainability. And so what we find is that there's about 20% of consumers who are just not thinking about sustainability at all in their purchases. And that's this unconcerned group. There's another 20% who are caring about sustainability and they're already making decisions based on sustainability. And these are our core consumers. So they're another 20%. But as you can see, the majority of consumers, that mainstream 60%, they care about sustainability, but they aren't taking action based on sustainability today because there are other things that matter more to them. And for us to really win with that mainstream consumer and drive growth of this sector, we really need to think about what matters to those mainstream consumers. So let's double click on that in a little bit more detail. On the left-hand side here, we've got data from a consumer survey, again, about fresh foods. And we asked consumers, what are your top needs when you're buying fresh food? And the top two that came out were health and taste. On the right-hand side, we specifically asked those questions in a survey about alternative proteins. And similarly, we see that the top two criteria are taste and health as well. Now, it's important to note that these drivers do vary a little bit by consumer segment and like the type of occasion that consumers are buying. But in general, the taste and health criteria are what really matter to mainstream consumers a lot more than claims like sustainability. But what's really interesting is that over the last year, what we've seen is there's been a decreasing association of alternative meats with health and taste. So on the left-hand side, we see data from social media conversations about alternative proteins, and the topics of taste and health, the conversations on those topics have decreased, and the conversations on topics associated with more negative terms like processed and complex toxins have increased. And that's what suggests that there's a bit of a mismatch between what consumers really care about in this mainstream segment versus what they are perceiving the products to be about. So what can we really do about this? Well, to understand this, we actually analyzed over 100 recent behavioral science articles to identify some specific strategies that companies can use in their front of pack marketing. So these are some insights for you to think about as you're designing that for your products. We focus on front of pack specifically because this is where the marketing real estate is most limited, but you can think about these insights to other consumer touch points as well. So of these 4 strategies, 2 of them are quick wins. So we're saying that they're relevant across the board and they're relatively straightforward to implement for everyone. So these are around limiting vegan and vegetarian labeling. And I'm sure you have lots of questions about that, so I'll dig into that a little bit more shortly. And the second is identifying the alternative protein source. The other 2 are more occasion-dependent practices. And what we mean by that is that implementing it requires a little bit more of a nuanced understanding of who the target consumer is and also what that occasion is and the needs behind that occasion that they're buying for. So these 2 are around highlighting the product's sensory appeal and highlighting the health benefits. And so to give you an example of what I mean by a occasion and that occasion dependent practice. So let's say you have a product that's really tailored to an occasion where someone wants an indulgent treat and all they care about is something that's really tasty and delicious. Well, then the highlighting of positive health benefits isn't going to be as important, but highlighting the product sensory appeal is going to be really important. So I'll walk you through each one of these 4 in a little bit more detail. So the first one, limiting vegan or vegetarian labeling. The context here is that, and the rationale is that we think about the actual market, vegans and vegetarians, they're a very small proportion of the entire US consumer base, so just 5% combined. So if we're really trying to go after that mainstream consumer and drive growth of these products, then we need to focus beyond that. And I'm a vegan, and I'm sure many of you in the audience are as well. So this probably feels like a slightly counterintuitive statement as we're thinking about these vegan products. But if we want to really think about how we grow the sector and really expand beyond that core group, it's important to think about who those, where that population lies. And interestingly, what we found is that if we prominently feature a vegan label, there can be some risks to it as well. So one, sometimes in research, it's been found to be a barrier, psychological barrier, because it introduces that identity-based label. Obviously, that resonates with people who are vegan, but then given that the majority of consumers aren't, it could put them off. Secondly, in the research that the Good Food Institute did in collaboration with Mind Lab, we see that having this label is actually associated with lower purchase intent compared to terms like plant-based. And then thirdly, when we explicitly asked consumers in the research, we found that they didn't actually find it as important a claim. So what we recommend instead is we just use terms like does not contain animal products to convey the same message. And then on the back of your pack, you can have a statement like suitable for vegans to make sure that the vegan consumers actually understand that it's suitable for them. Our next quick win is identifying the alternative protein source. So what the evidence shows is that specifying the protein source is associated with higher overall ratings by a margin of about 5 to 18%. So the takeaway here is there's some differences based on the type of protein, but it's always better to state what the protein source is versus to not state it. And in addition to driving those overall higher ratings, specifying that alternative protein source also drives higher taste and health scores as well. And this can be done with words, with labels, but also with images as well. And interestingly, one company who implemented this experienced a 40% increase in sales by very clearly specifying the protein source in their labeling. So it has tangible business benefits. Next, we'll talk about the first occasion-dependent practice, which is highlighting the product's sensory appeal. So when you have a product that really delivers on some aspect of that sensory experience, for example, like taste or texture, or even the emotional enjoyment of eating it, then highlighting it on the front of pack messaging can drive choice. So the chart on the left-hand side shows the results of a study that looked at the effect of changing the labels on plant-based dishes. So in one condition, they had a simple description, which was just green beans, and that factually just stated what the food was. And then in another, they added that indulgent labeling. So they said sweet, sizzling green beans. And they added some of those sensory elements to it as well. And the frequency with which people chose the dish was 25% higher than when it carried that indulgent label versus when it was a more factual label. And whilst this study was about vegetable dishes, there is evidence that this holds true for plant-based analogs of meat and dairy as well. And on packaging, in addition to those labels of indulgent, of sensory language, it's actually a good opportunity to use visuals, which when you do that well, can actually drive some of those taste associations, overall appeal, and that purchase intent as well. And finally, our last practice is an occasion-dependent one again. And here we recommend highlighting the positive health benefits. And I'll emphasize the word positive there because the research shows that consumers respond more to health claims that use positive language versus restrictive language. So for example, saying high protein versus low in calorie. And what we're recommending here is actually going beyond simply just sharing the nutritional information, like 10 grams of protein, and actually saying great source of protein. Now, of course, there's regulation that has restrictions on what the nutritional profile actually needs to be in order to deliver on this. So we need to obviously make sure that that holds true. And we see that including these kinds of positive health benefits on the front of pack increases the willingness to consume the product. And interestingly, there's a halo effect on the increased perceived sustainability as well as an added bonus. So those are the 4 best practices we've identified through the behavioral research. And what's interesting is that alternative dairy is a really helpful case study of how this can be done to drive mainstream growth. So when we analyze the front of pack messaging for the top 25 alternative dairy brands out there, and we found that most of them, 88%, are implementing 2 out of 4 of these best practices. So for example, many brands are using dairy-free instead of vegan. They're identifying and showing the protein source through visuals. They are using that sensory language like rich and creamy, and they're highlighting the positive health benefits like calcium or omega or vitamin A. What's really interesting as a comparison is that when we look at the alternative meat brands, the top 25 of them in the market, only 56% of them are implementing at least 2 of these best practices. Many of them are limiting the vegan labeling, but relatively few of them are identifying the protein source and highlighting the positive health benefits, and even fewer of them are emphasizing that sensory appeal. Now, why does all of this matter? Well, we see tangible business benefits when we look at the retail sales performance of these brands. So this chart shows the retail sales indexed to 2019. And we see that alternative meat brands on the green line who are implementing 2 or more of these best practices are outperforming the competitors by 6x. Now, of course, there could be a range of other drivers behind the brand's performance, but beyond this. But this analysis really suggests that there's real value in applying some of these insights from behavioral science on how companies can really approach their front of pack messaging. So just to summarize, there's 4 steps to put all of this research into action and for you to all think about as you're building your companies. So the first is we really need to understand the needs of that mainstream consumer. And this is mostly through primary research. Now, I know many of you in the audience might not have budgets to do that primary consumer surveys, But we can still do other forms of primary research like consumer interviews, focus groups, shop-alongs, really taking the time to spend time in those consumer shoes in the occasions where they're shopping for your product and the needs that are driving those. The second is that there is still an opportunity as an industry for us to innovate where gaps exist relative to conventional meat products in terms of taste, texture, and price. So really think about that as you're developing the products you're taking to market. And then thirdly, as you're thinking about the messaging and the front of pack, whether that be on front of pack or across other consumer touch points, think about the consumer needs for that occasion and broadening the dialogue beyond things like sustainability so that we can really hit those mainstream consumer needs. And then finally, rigorously testing and learning with a focus on what the consumers are doing versus saying. What we saw for those mainstream consumers is there's a big gap between what they say they care about versus how they actually behave. So it's really important to really test these in the field and make sure we're responding to what the consumers are doing. So I'll pause there and I'm happy to take any questions that you have. So first questions that's come up from Kate, do you think highlighting the protein source conflicts with the perception of taste? Do you have data to support that? It does not. So that's a great question. I think the interesting piece here is that consumers just, and I'll jump back to that slide, is that consumers just really want to know what's in their product. And I think that makes sense in terms of just creating that transparency and visibility. We don't have any data that suggests that it conflicts with the perception of taste. And actually, interestingly, we found that stating the protein source actually drives higher taste scores because consumers feel that they know what's in their product. So we have an anonymous question. How do we fight that plant-based is too processed? That's a great question, and I think there's a lot of actions that can be taken. I think one is the main piece. I think that we can focus on here. There's obviously industry-wide actions that can help, and I know that there's many individuals already thinking about that. I think as individual companies, I think what can be done is really being clear with the consumers about what's in the product, what the positive health benefits are, identifying the protein source, and just being very clear and transparent on the communications. And then secondly, I think the other thing I'd note here is that while that is a narrative in the industry, there are certain occasions that people shop for where you don't care about health as much. And you do care about taste a lot more. And in those conditions, I think delivering on that taste, even if it does require some more additional ingredients, actually fulfills that consumer need. And so that's why I think there's nuance here in terms of that processed narrative, because that health and taste sometimes can require different ingredients. Should your approach be affected by where you plan to sell your products? And this is a question from Connie. Thanks for asking that. I think this is really interesting because I think it really depends on who your consumers are and what occasion they're buying their products for. So it goes back down to really understanding the consumers. So for example, if you're selling your products for a health-based occasion, then you want to focus on some more of those health-based claims, and even in terms of identifying that protein source, etc., those matter more. But in terms of if it's a more indulgent occasion and you really just want something that tastes great, then you want to focus on some more of those sensory type messages. And in terms of where those products are sold, I think these messages still hold true regardless of some of those consumer touch points. And so I think it really just depends on what the occasion is more than what the location is. Question from Tracy. Do mainstream consumers think plant-based includes animal products? I often see conflicting definitions. This is a good question. It's not something that we specifically looked into. I think in terms of the labeling, I think it's important if we use terms like plant-based to have a statement too, like does not contain animal products or something like 100% plant-based, just to avoid some of that doubt. But it's not something that we saw come up through the research. Question from another anonymous participant. Do we know why mainstream consumers are so put off by the vegan label? Good question. I think the main thing that we saw from the consumer research is that sometimes it acts as a bit of a psychological barrier because it's identity based. So if consumers think, I'm not vegan, is this product for me? Or if I consume this, what does it say about me? And it creates a bit of that confusion in potentially consumers' minds. And that's something that we just want to avoid. The great question. Great question. So we have one on how do we position whey from fermentation dairy products with the vegan market? This is a great one. I think going back to some of our principles here, I'd say that firstly, having a very clear identification of what's in here. So the protein source is whey from fermentation products. So that's one. The second is, I think, being very clear. This doesn't contain animal products because it's not from the animal, but then being very clear where it does come from. And I think being very clear on, this isn't something that you would say is 100% plant-based. So just being very clear where it comes from, and the fact that it isn't from an animal. I think that's all we can really do is be transparent. Question on baked goods. So how would you use the steps 2 to 4 for vegan baked goods? Great question. I'd say they same things apply. I think here, in terms of the alternative protein source, it probably doesn't matter as much because it's not something that people are looking for in terms of protein. But definitely, I'd say highlighting the product sensory appeal, it really matters here. So if it's supposed to be creamy or if it's supposed to be, soft or spongy or whatever the texture and taste that we're looking to create with that baked good. So I think in this context, point 3 is probably what matters the most. If you're going for a vegan baked good that's actually supposed to be deliver on some health benefits, then making sure we're highlighting those as well. And I think point 1 here also applies. So instead of calling it a vegan baked good, can we call it something else and just make it clear it doesn't contain any animal ingredients or is 100% plant-based?
Thank you so much, Neeru. We have so many questions. We could keep going all friggin' day.
It's been great to be here. Great questions. I loved all the engagement and the thoughtfulness behind them.
Yeah, 100%. So as a reminder to folks, if you highlight over Neeru's name or my name while we're up on stage, you will see our LinkedIn's. You definitely want to share and follow everything that Neeru is doing because you've been really providing invaluable data. So I really recommend people connect. I will give you a quick shout out though. So Alicia already said Best Friends Animal Sanctuary. Do you want to give a shout out to any project you are working on while you're in front of everybody? You've got the moment.
Oh, great question. I'd say stay tuned for more reports, interesting reports from BCG in 2024. We have several in the pipeline that we're collaborating on with GFI, with Synthesis Capital, who's another firm in the UK, and various other organizations. So lots of really interesting insights coming your way.
Awesome. All right. So hope you can stay and watch some of the pitch competition later today. As a reminder to everybody, there's a huge audience filled with amazing people to connect with. So let's make sure that we are facilitating all these conversations offline when this competition ends and we can keep it going. I will say adieu, Neeru. Thank you so
Thank
much for
you.
joining.
Thanks, everyone.